Hi everyone. Okay. Thank you for joining the live. I think Abhishek is also here. I will just quickly add him. Hi Abhishek.
Hi,
Hi. How are you?
how are you?
All good. All good.
I'm good.
Okay. Quickly, I'll just introduce everybody to what we're chatting about today. Once again, everyone, thank you for joining the IG Live. My name is Shreya Adhikari, and today I'm going to be chatting with Abhishek Jain, Fellow and Director of the Powering Livelihoods Initiative at the Council for Energy, Environment and Water, or CEEW. As many of you may already know, CEEW is one of Asia's leading nonprofit research institutions. Today, I'm going to be chatting with Abhishek to understand how climate change is affecting the food that we eat. A little bit about Abhishek before we get into the conversation. Abhishek built and leads CEEW's practices on energy access, rural livelihoods, and sustainable food systems. In over 9 years of his experience, he has focused on various issues, including fossil fuel subsidies, LPG for cooking, renewable access, and more. He has published in leading international journals and national dailies, and he regularly advises senior officials. Welcome, Abhishek, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So, heading straight into the conversation, to set some context for everyone who's joined us, could you give a broad overview of the various ways in which the climate change emergency right now is impacting the food that we eat?
Right. Sure, sure. First of all, thank you for having me. Really excited. So talking about how climate is impacting the food that we eat, or more broadly, the food system that we are all part of, at least as a consumer, if nothing else, right? Uh, I mean, one very obvious way is the increasing temperatures are going to change the productivity of our agriculture. In some cases, it can increase the productivity, especially if the colder climates are becoming slightly warmer. But wherever there is already warm climates, it can reduce the productivity. In fact, just a little less than a year ago, last harvesting of Rabi season in India, when we harvest a lot of wheat, we saw a 15% decline in the wheat output in the country just because there was early onset of heat waves, early onset of summer. And that is a very, very tangible way in which climate change is impacting our food production. We know that wheat along with rice are some of the staple food crops in India. And we have and a 15% decline can mean significantly uh, hazardous challenges for the low-income groups. You're not able to provide enough food in the public distribution system. The prices go up. The quality of the grain has come down because of the heat onset. But there's just one way, like which is very direct, increasing temperatures, reducing the production. But there are many other impacts of climate change. If you look at the extreme events in this country, almost 80% of India's district are climate hotspots, which means that one or the other climate related disaster event are going to occur there in a very, very high frequency. It could be increased number of floods, it could be more intense droughts, it could be greater number of cyclones, and all of these are going to impact our production system, our farms. We have seen the cyclones in the coastal areas of the country, Andhra Pradesh, Odisha, taking away entire paddy farms in one go. Similarly, entire banana farms have been uprooted because of these cyclones. We are seeing a 20-fold increase in the flood intensity in this country in the last 50 odd years. Now, of course, climate is something that is changing slowly, but there are tipping points. And beyond certain tipping points, the impact on these disastrous events become manifold. And that's what we are seeing. We're also seeing a very interesting thing, which is some of the drought prone areas are becoming flood prone, and some of the flood prone areas are becoming drought prone. Now, that then changes the way farmers need to cope up with these natural disasters. The intensities of rain are increasing and their windows are becoming smaller. So, which means that the food that we are producing is more risky now in terms of for farmers to take that business on. But at the same time, they need to rely a lot more on irrigation sources because the rain periods are shrinking. You get probably the same amount of water, but in very limited periods, and that's why you see floods also happening. These are some of the ways in which the climate is very directly impacting our food on a day-to-day basis.
Thanks, Abhishek. You mentioned wheat and rice, and rice in this scenario for India specifically poses a unique challenge because India is one of the biggest producers and consumers of rice. Um, but rice yields are also declining, right? Because of what all you mentioned. But at the same time, rice is also one of the biggest producers of methane, which is a greenhouse gas, which contributes to climate change. So how do we think about even solving for something like this?
Yeah, that's why it is a difficult problem, right? I mean, at one end you have a commodity which is a staple for hundreds and millions. I mean, it is the case in India, but also the case in several other parts of the world. Rice is a staple crop. But at the same time, it is also one of the significant contributor to the climate story. And you talked about methane. I'll come to methane maybe just in a minute. But I also want to highlight that rice is a fairly water-intensive crop. So we do end up using a lot of electricity to pump a whole lot of water, which is being used to then cultivate rice or even other water-intensive crops like sugarcane. Now, just the power that we use in our agriculture for irrigation purposes amounts to about 7% of India's total greenhouse gas emissions annually. Now, that's the amount of footprint that just pumping water has vis-a-vis our food system. Now, let's talk about methane. Now, methane, as some of our viewers would already know, is what we call a short-lived climate pollutant, which means that it is not going to stay in the environment unlike carbon or carbon dioxide for 100 years, but it will stay in the environment for about 12 years. But while it stays in the environment, it heats up the environment almost 27 times more than carbon dioxide, which then means that it contributes to the global warming, especially in the short run if you're not able to tackle methane. Now, what happens that most of the paddy that we do, most of the rice that we do in this country, and much like anywhere else in the world, is in a flooded irrigation system. You always have a pool of water in which the rice is being grown. Now, that flooded ecosystem creates anaerobic condition, and you get a lot of methane. Now, one way to reduce that methane is to not create flooded situations for irrigation, but rather use techniques which are now becoming popular, something called alternative drying and wetting. So you give irrigation, you provide an irrigation, but then you wait until it dries out before you do the next irrigation. And a lot of the rice now, especially being produced in states like Punjab, has started following this. Even another system called System of Rice Intensification, SRI, also tries to advocate similar approaches for alternative wetting and drying. But here's the story, and here's the catch. While alternative drying and wetting reduces methane emission because it doesn't create anaerobic condition, at times it can increase what we call nitrous dioxide emission, N2O. Now, nitrous oxide emissions are another very tricky climate pollutant. They are actually 10 times more potent than even methane. So they're almost 280 times more potent than carbon dioxide. Plus, they end up staying in the atmosphere for more than carbon dioxide, which means that if we are reducing methane at the cost of nitrous dioxide, that's not a great thing to do. We need to reduce methane while ensuring that N2O emissions do not go up. And that's the tricky part. The science is still not yet fully sorted on that. One of the ways to do it is put fertilizer only as much required. Any excess fertilizer will find its way into the environment, either in the form of nitrous oxide emissions or in the form of nitrogen pollutants going into the water. Two, there are now technologies emerging where you can create inhibitors in these fertilizers so that the nitrous oxide emissions do not get generated, because bacteria in the soil are actually working on the fertilizer to create these emissions. So those are some of the emerging tech, but really using fertilizer only as much required and not any excess amount, but also being judicious about the way we use water and moving to these alternative wetting and drying practices can help us tackle both the methane part, but also the nitrous oxide emission part.
Okay. And so, now we've extensively sorry, did you want to add anything, Abhishek?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that is just about how we are producing rice. But there are few things that go beyond it. It is about, can we just increase the productivity per hectare of land, which means that you will get more rice with the same emissions, because the emissions are really a factor of the land on which you are producing rice, not really how much you are producing.
Okay.
And even I'll take it beyond and say that why to consume that much rice at the first place? Why not diversify our food plate and look at various other alternatives in the form of millets and other grains that can substitute some of our rice consumption and reduce the amount of emissions and associated challenges that we have with regards to climate.
Great. And this is exactly what my next question was going to be, right? That consumption patterns then also need to shift in that case. And we've announced a Millets Mission, but, you know, I just wanted to understand what needs to happen beyond this, right? To nudge different parts of society to change their consumption patterns, because I'm assuming that's also equally a difficult path to take as much as changing production patterns is.
Yes, and probably harder because we're talking about changing consumption pattern of about 1.4 billion people, right? So, having said that, of course, it is a fairly hard one because why it is hard, I guess many of us understand. Palates are a sticky thing. What we have been eating growing up, we like to sort of continue consuming the same things. The other thing is that while we are talking about now millets, there is a International Year of Millet, as we are talking about this new sort of new age grain, so to say, while it is one of the oldest set of grains available to us from millennia. We are seeing that many folks, especially in the urban India, are not even familiar with this grain. They've not consumed it growing up. So there is already a barrier to create that shift or move from your staple of wheat and rice to these millets. And that unfamiliarity sort of creates hesitation, be it in the form of not knowing how to cook it, how to really make interesting recipes out of it. And unless there is some other motivation and driver, which could be that, okay, we make them aspirational, people want to consume it, or we really talk about the nutritional value of these alternative grains so that people have another incentive to consume, it is difficult for people to cross that unfamiliarity barrier.
Right.
There's really no incentive why I should spend more time and effort in figuring out how to cook millets, what to make out of it, and so on. That's one thing, like consumer preferences, the palates and taste, plus the unfamiliarity associated. The other challenge is when we talk about rural India, is that many of them are likely aware about some of the millets, if not all the millets, which are available locally, etc. But millet has been unfortunately considered a grain for the low income, lower caste households. It is never considered a mainstream grain. I mean, in the rural Indian context, if you are consuming wheat and rice, you are considered someone who is doing well in the society. And that perception needs to be broken in a big way. And one way I see that it can happen is if you start putting millets as aspirational food. Once urban India, once high income groups start consuming it, it will automatically create an aspiration in the lower income groups to again start embracing millet in their local context. Now, having said that, what is it that we can do to really create some momentum, some consumption shifts on this front? I think one, very broadly speaking, both government as well as private sector has an important role to play. Let me start with the government. There is still 70% of India that gets touched by government through their ration shops, the PDS shops that we all know, from where almost 70% of India still procures some of their food supplies, be it rice, be it wheat, and sometimes sugar, sometimes a little bit of pulses and oil. So how can we shift what we are procuring, what the government is procuring from the farmers in the form of wheat and rice, but move it a little bit towards millets and other indigenous grains? Now that shift will touch almost 70% of Indian population. Similarly, what we are supplying in midday meal schemes, what we are giving in even our trains. I mean, Shatabdi, and if some of you may have traveled in the recent months, that legendary Son Papdi of Haldiram has been now changed with a Ragi Laddu. Now that is a shift we want to bring so that all those who are traveling will have a first-hand experience of tasting what does a Ragi Laddu taste like and maybe create a first level of aspiration, first level of interest to start trying out millets. Similarly, private sector, I think, has a big role to play. Oats have become popular in India thanks to a few brands. Can we not do a similar thing with millets? I think we certainly can if private sector really wants to run behind it. Those are, I think, some of the ways in which we can bring a shift. MasterChef is another interesting example. How can programs like those start including millet-based recipes into their contests and create really a huge awareness campaign around millets in the country?
Right. That was a very interesting point towards the end specifically. You know, the private sector can definitely do a lot more. But I'm assuming that there as well, right, there needs to be some sort of push policies-wise incentives for the private sector to want to move. Coming to a little bit of a more sort of abstract question, but considering that you work on sustainable food systems, what does the future of food look like, right? So what is a sustainable plate? What is a sustainable diet in this scenario? And, you know, if you could, you know, touch upon what producers may need to do, what policymakers may need to do, and what consumers then, like us, may also need to do.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, the mother of all questions, right? What does sustainable food system and a sustainable plate going to look like, and the role for different actors? So we think of this in three ways. We think that we need to change what we are eating to sustainable and healthy diets. I'll come to that. Like, what do I mean by that? Which means that consumers have a big role to play in terms of what they are going to consume. Second, we believe we need to change how we produce our food. What we produce will get governed by what consumers are demanding, but how we produce food is where we need to work with farmers to change the practices. Currently, if you look at modern agriculture, most of the agriculture practices are input intensive. You're putting in a lot of water, you're putting in a lot of chemicals in the form of pesticides and fertilizer, and then you're trying to generate the food. We need to move up towards a resource conservative agriculture, where you are using limited resources but trying to maximize the nutritional output from the same farm.
Right.
And third, what we need to change, and that's where the role of private sector comes in, is how the food really moves between a farm to your plate. And they're changing how much we are processing, where are we processing, what energy are we using in processing it, how much water are we using in processing it, because the food footprint in that value chain is also significant.
Right.
And that is what is shaping our choices. I mean, the same flour, the atta, can be used to create a roti, can be used to create a Maggi. But the footprint of the two is significantly different.
Could you
Now, talking about, sorry, go ahead.
Could you give, you know, some of us who've tuned in, some of the viewers, an example of how exactly it differs, like just from farm to plate?
Yes. So, I mean, one, the processing energy that you're going to spend in processing the food, then the packaging and transportation that is going to get added into that value chain. So essentially, between the farm, if you are just doing a milling in your local mill and then consuming the flour in the form of chapati directly at your home, vis-a-vis taking that raw material into a factory which is not necessarily even in the same state, but a few thousand miles away, then processing it in a facility with a lot of additional energy and water footprint, and then bringing it back to the consumer again through thousands of miles of transportation, along with the packaging footprint associated with it. That's how you end up increasing the overall footprint. But now I will go back to that first point, like how can we create a sustainable and healthy diet or plate for consumers in India? And what do I really mean by that? It's really about, I mean, think about more than often, the food that is good for you is actually also good for the planet. The amount of rice and wheat dependency we have in this country, especially rice, it is a fairly carb-heavy food with very limited fiber and very limited micronutrients. I'm not saying we should not eat rice, but we need to certainly reduce the amount of rice we are eating. And as we substitute some of that with alternative grains, we are not just making it healthy for ourselves, but we are also making it healthier for the planet. be it millets, be it other hardy grains, and so on. Two, if we can reduce a little bit of our consumption of what I would call intensive dairy products. In India, we are already producing enough dairy in the form of milk and milk products that are sufficient for Indian population. But not everyone is getting enough to consume because few income groups, especially the high income groups, are consuming almost 8 times more than what the low income groups are consuming in this country. Which means that one, it is not good for your health because very high intake of dairy products is associated with some of the health challenges. At the same time, it is not great for the planet. More than 55 to 60% of our agriculture emissions are only because of dairy products in this country. Again, I'm not saying that we should reduce dairy consumption, but we need to make sure that high income groups are reducing and low income groups are getting more opportunities to consume nutritious food. Similarly, let's talk about sugar. Sugar is neither good for you in excessive amounts nor good for the planet given the amount of water that it takes to create sugarcane. And almost 60% of sugar, where it gets consumed in the country, it is getting consumed in the processed goods. It's not directly sugar you and I are consuming in our homes, but it is really the processed food, all your Coke, all your juices and whatnot that we are consuming. That's where a lot of the sugar is. So it's really about moving towards healthier diet, which will automatically move towards sustainable diets. I would also say that in general, we need to think a lot more about consuming seasonal and local. That automatically reduces the amount of energy that is going into storing that food. Imagine that if you're trying to consume a mango in the month of December, that mango would have stayed in a cold storage at least for 5-6 months, right? Now, there is a footprint of running that cold storage. There is an energy footprint, there is a carbon footprint. So instead of craving for a mango in December, one should actually crave for the seasonal fruits which are available in that particular season,
right,
plus which are ideally harvested in a local vicinity. Of course, a few hundred kilometers is great, but yeah, if you're really trying to transport food from one end of the country to the other end, or from overseas to India, we see a lot of imported food in high-end communities. That is aspirational, but that is not great for you or the planet.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Abhishek. You've kind of given us this sort of broad overview of, how climate change and the climate emergency is impacting the food that we eat. I wanted to ask if there was anything else that you wanted to add, if you wanted the viewers to take away something else.
Yeah, I would say try and diversify your food plate. Do not just keep consuming a few things. The moment you diversify, you will end up creating a space and a demand because we think, oh, what is going to happen with my choices getting changed as a consumer? But when 100 billion, when 1.4 billion change their choices, that really shakes the markets in a big way. Farmers are going to produce only what the market is going to demand. So if you want farmers to produce millets, if you want farmers to create more climate resilient crops and food, you need to demand that as a consumer. So even every single consumer choice will have an impact on what this country would produce and how it will produce. And the second thing I would say is eat local, eat seasonal, reduce dairy if you are excessively consuming it. And those are some of the very concrete ways in which many of us as consumers can really shape the food system of the future that we would like to see for ourselves as well as coming generations.
Thank you so much, Abhishek. I really enjoyed today's conversation. I felt like got at least a little bit of a, just a primer on, again, how climate change interacts with the food that we're eating. Thank you so much. And I hope our viewers also enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Shreya.